Welcome to today's webinar, which is titled Work Authorization for Newcomers, Everyone Wins, brought to you by the American Immigration Council. We are grateful that so many of you can join us today to discuss this very important topic. My name is Adriel Orozco, and I'm a Senior Policy Counsel at the American Immigration Council. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. I just wanted to let everybody know that this webinar is closed to the press. So if you're a member of the press, we ask that you please log off at this time. For those of you unfamiliar with the Council, we are a nonprofit organization who believes that the U.S. immigration system should be fair, just, and welcoming. We pursue this objective through a multi-pronged approach, including impact litigation, advocacy, research, transparency efforts, narrative change, and expanding access to counsel for immigrants. I would like to introduce today's speakers and provide an overview of what we will be covering in today's webinar. While people arriving to the United States want to work, and businesses have jobs openings to fill, many newcomers aren't allowed to support themselves due to the barriers in obtaining work authorization that currently exist. Today, we will be talking about what employment authorization is, what are some of the barriers that exist, and how we can make the system work better for everyone involved. Today, we have our speakers, D. Daniel Scriven, Director of the Office of New Americans for the state of Colorado, and Cristina Moreno, Policy Counsel for the Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project. Before we begin, I would like to review just some logistical items with everyone. Today's webinar will be recorded. We will email that recording to everyone who registered for this webinar. We will also have about 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. Our audience will be muted throughout the webinar. If you have a question for our speakers, please put your question in the Q&A box on your screen, which you'll see right at the bottom. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions as possible. We will also have about 15 minutes at the end to answer those questions. And if those folks who just joined, I just want to remind everybody that this webinar is closed to the press. So if you are a member of the press, we ask that you please log off. So we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll turn first to Cristina. Cristina, can you just tell us what is employment authorization and why do people need to get it to work?
Thank you so much, Adriel. Hi, everyone. Employment authorization is the ability to work legally in the United States. It's important because there are serious consequences for immigrants who work without employment authorization and for their employers. So for immigrants, it could make someone ineligible for a future benefit, such as a green card, and for their employers, it could subject them to civil, monetary penalties, or even criminal penalties.
Thank you, Cristina. And so, really why this question comes up right now is because, we've seen that several newly arrived migrants have reached many of the United States' largest cities, including more than 190,000 in New York City, 35,000 in Chicago, and nearly 40,000 in Denver. We keep hearing that migrants are unable to work while they have to rely on local resources for basic needs like housing and other supportive services. What are the legal and processing barriers to work authorization for people who are newly arriving in the United States?
Thank you so much for the question, Adriel. To answer it, it might be helpful to provide just a little bit of background information and context about how to obtain work authorization and what's a work permit. So I'll try to keep this brief, and I have just a few slides to kind of help guide and reference during this. So for those who might not have seen it, this is a work permit. A work permit is a document that demonstrates that someone is eligible to work in the United States. As you can see, it's a physical card that has a photo and an expiration date on the front. And before someone can apply for a work permit, they have to demonstrate that they are eligible for a work permit. And your eligibility depends on your immigration status. So as you can see on the next slide, there are 3 common ways that someone might be eligible for a work permit. So first, someone has to have applied for asylum and have a pending asylum application. That's one category. Second, someone can receive a grant of parole. And parole is temporary permission to live in the United States. Once you have parole, you can immediately apply for a work permit. And you might have seen on the news, the administration recently created a few parole programs for applicants from Afghanistan, Ukraine, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And also, if you obtain a CBP-1 appointment at the Mexico-US border, you're typically eligible for a 2-year grant of parole. And third, finally, someone might be eligible for temporary protected status or TPS, which is a temporary status provided to individuals who are in the United States who cannot return to their country of origin due to an ongoing armed conflict, an environmental disaster, or some other extraordinary temporary condition. And you can apply for a work permit at the same time that you apply for temporary protected status. Your question was about barriers to work authorization. There are many barriers for people in each of these categories. But for the interest of time today, I'll focus more on the problems that people with pending asylum applications experience when they apply for a work permit. So first, there are long wait periods before someone seeking asylum can obtain a work permit. So there is a law on the books that says that asylum seekers must wait 180 days after they apply for asylum before they're able to obtain an initial work permit. Second, the application to apply for a work permit is long and complicated, and this affects applicants in all categories. So for example, the application is now 7 pages. It used to be only 2 pages. And finally, there are lots of delays processing work permit applications. So that was just a bit of information about some of the barriers that applicants are facing when applying for work authorization. But I did want to emphasize that there are solutions to these problems. To share just a little bit more about ASAP, ASAP is a membership organization. ASAP members come from 175 countries to seek asylum, and ASAP members live in every US state. ASAP members have identified a number of ways to improve this process. For processing times, USCIS can hire more staff, make this a bigger priority within the agency. For the law on the books, Congress can change the law, and there is a bipartisan bill to do just that. And then finally, while USCIS is doing that, because of the processing delays, there's a risk that when someone applies to renew their work authorization, they could experience a gap if USCIS doesn't send that new work permit card in time. And there are things that USCIS can do to address that gap. So there are solutions to some of these barriers. And I'll turn it back to you, Adriel.
Thanks, Christina. And so now we're going to turn over to Dee. And so we heard Christina say that there's a lot of complexity. We're focusing on, 3 particular populations, but I'm sure, as Deborah has seen, many new arrivals. You've seen a lot of folks who are applying for TPS, a lot of folks who are applying for asylum, a lot of folks who have parole, which is pretty complex for folks who maybe aren't really in this space as often. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you've seen, the legal and processing barriers, and with these populations and how they play out in Denver?
Thank you, Adrielle, and thank you to the American Immigration Council for this invitation. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. So I just want to back us up and just tell you a little bit about our Colorado context, so you guys have context in which you're hearing what I'm saying. So in Colorado, we had a historic influx start in December of 2022. So historic meaning we didn't have a nonprofit infrastructure of nonprofits that served folks without legal status or who are in immigration proceedings. And so the state immediately started advocating with the White House and the Department of Homeland Security for employment authorization for all new arrivals. And because a lot of our new arrivals, probably 95% or greater at first, were all Venezuelan, we also asked for expanded TPS for Venezuelans. The other thing we asked about is we didn't want to forget those Coloradans who have been working in Colorado for decades, who have been in the shadows, undocumented workers, who are really the backbone of Colorado's economy. So we also ensured that when we were putting forward these requests, we also made sure we didn't forget about those Coloradans who are a vital part of our state. So Colorado has 2 jobs for every 1 unemployed person. So this really, we saw it as this could be a win-win. If you give every new arrival employment authorization, we could fill all of our needs for workforce. And really that's the same around the whole country. Birth rates are declining. We have an aging population, workforce shortages in so many sectors. At least in Colorado, I know of companies that are passing up federal contracts because they do not have the talent to fulfill the contract. So new arrivals, they're desperate to work. They're desperate to provide for themselves and their families and contribute to their communities. And as you all know, or most of you probably know, all these new arrivals are not eligible for benefits, for federal benefits and very limited state benefits in Colorado. And so many new arrivals, the way it plays out here in Colorado is many new arrivals have to seek employment, whether they have employment authorization or not, out of necessity, because they need to be able to provide for themselves and their families. And for those folks who don't have employment authorization, they will experience exploitation, and they have. They will experience wage theft. They will experience inconsistent payments to sustain themselves. And so in September of 2023, we were surprised and thrilled, overjoyed when the federal government decided to expand TPS for Venezuelans, because we saw, wow, that means a lot of our new arrivals, they can actually, apply for TPS and get employment authorization. And so we quickly drafted a proposal. The Office of New Americans quickly drafted a proposal, shopped it around to philanthropy and said, hey, can you help us start setting up legal assistance clinics here? Because we now have a huge population that's eligible to apply for this benefit. And we received a private anonymous donation of $500,000. And we called together the legal services providers to see who wanted to do this work. And in Colorado, there's actually a dearth of immigration legal service providers. Only about 300 are registered with the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And if you talk to the folks who raised their hands, they said, Dee, even though there's 300, really only 10 people volunteer whenever there's a humanitarian crisis. And we are tired of volunteering. We still have law school loans. We are exhausted. Like, help us out. Like, we can't do this. And at first, a few partners raised their hands. We had the University of Denver Law School. Shout out to all these people if you're on the call. Catholic Charities of Denver, the Justice and Mercy Legal Aid Center. And they signed up and they said, we can do this many hundred, we can do this many hundred, even despite their heavy caseloads. And in this process, we started that in November of 2023. And in this process, we had a couple of folks, Brandon Roche, an immigration attorney, Carrie Drum, who's a consultant that we hired to do some logistics and administration for us, and Adam Coachman on my team. They came up with this idea to develop a virtual law firm model. And ONA funded it with these private funds that we got. And later on, the state kicked in $1 million more in funding. And the Rose Community Foundation applied for that funding with Brandon and Carrie, and they launched version 2.0 of the Colorado Virtual TPS project. And maybe at a later time, they can get into the nuts and bolts of it, but I just want you to have a snapshot of the project. Basically, we hired community-based organizations who knew the populations to do an intake of their documents, to see if they were eligible for TPS, to collect all that information, to put it on a database. Brandon would go through and do quality control of those applications, and then he would ship those applications out to immigration attorneys across the country. Those attorneys would call these clients, finalize the application, and then with a partnership that we established with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, they actually would come to Colorado. First time historically ever. I think they've also done this in New York and Chicago. They would conduct biometrics, waive fees, and expedite processing of the applications. And so, like, amazing partnership all around. And while we started off slow in November of 2023, to date, our state partners and together the state in this process, we've submitted 1,546 applications to date. 942 are TPS EAD and 604 are EAD only. And by the end of this week, we are expecting to submit another 600 TPS EAD applications, which would bring our total to 2,146 applications, which to me, I think that is such a success, because that's not just applications. Those are people, those are families, those are Coloradans who are now able to care for themselves and their families, which is massive. So after, and Adriel, please cut me off if I keep talking. I still have a few things I want to say. So I'm going to try to sneak it in there, but cut me off. Give me a minute warning if I go over.
So no worries. Yeah, everything you're saying is amazing and great, and I think it's a gem. So please, yeah, keep going.
Okay, so after we did our first clinic, we were like, oh my goodness, all these people are about to have employment authorization. They need to get jobs. And so we reached out to our local workforce centers to see, hey, can you assist? Can you get these folks jobs? And they were like, we're not yet ready. We're preparing. We're going to be there soon. And so we were like, you know what, as ONA, we should just put on job fairs. And so we did. We reached out to partners, Emily Griffith, the Spring Institute, and Centro de los Trabajadores. And we put on our first employment fair in January. We had 11 employers attend and 140 job seekers. And then we threw another one. We hosted another one, our second job fair in March of 2024. We had 14 employers. And this time we were blown away with the amount of job seekers. 617 folks with employment authorization showed up. And at one point we were a little bit like, crowd control, like we don't have enough interpreters. This is a lot, but it really showed the need of how, once you get employment authorization, you really need that job placement piece. I'm happy to say the Denver Workforce Center took over. They had their first fair in May with great results. And that's currently what we're doing in Colorado. In terms of work that still needs to be done, we do still have more folks who need legal assistance. Our state funds are set to end at the end of June. We need more folks to help with job placement. We need to continue providing technical assistance to our workforce centers so that they can help with our newest arrivals. And we also need to educate employers on what that EAD is. Just like Christina was saying, here's the EAD, here's the picture. It's legitimate. Like, we actually created a flyer here in Colorado because we were hearing that people were applying and signing up, and then they were like, oh, you're not authorized. You have to leave. And we're like, wait, what? Like, yes, you are authorized. So also that public awareness campaign. And then finally, long-term, I think we need to build up immigration legal capacity in our state. And so those are some of the things that we're working on in Colorado, and those are some of the things, how it's playing out in Colorado. Thanks, Adrienne.
No, thanks, Dee. Yeah, there's a lot going on, and it seems like you've been able to find creative ways to sort of step up to the challenge, but then also with very few resources. And it seems like also, for folks that don't know, TPS is temporary protected status for folks who, from particular countries that designated by the federal government, that are experiencing some type of like civil unrest, natural disasters. And so I think there are about 16 countries that have TPS right now. And so, there are a lot of folks who are coming from or are being displaced in a lot of parts of the country. And that's one reason why we're seeing a lot of folks presenting themselves at the southern border and coming to the United States. And Venezuela, as folks know, is having a lot of economic issues. And Venezuelans a lot of Venezuelans have started to come to the United States. And something that has shifted in the past few years is that we were seeing more, initially, a lot of folks from Mexico were coming to the United States, like in the 90s, early 2000s. And then in the 2010s, we started seeing a lot of more families and kids from Central America. And now we're just seeing a greater variation of folks from even outside of the Western Hemisphere coming to the United States, and which really puts a lot of cities in a predicament because, there are folks who, the U.S. government systems are created thinking that folks who are presenting themselves at the border are going to be closer to us geographically. And so folks are going to be staying here longer to go through their processes, which just creates more challenges. And so it seems like TPS for the Venezuelan community was something that was very helpful to get work permits to people while they're here. And so can you just talk a little bit more about what are challenges for maybe that you've seen in other populations, folks who might not necessarily have TPS as an option, and how have you tried to address that? Have you been able to address that? And I'll pass that first to Dee, and then we'll see if Christina has
Thanks, Adriel. Yes, we definitely have seen that in Colorado. There are definitely folks who are not eligible for TPS. We have a lot of arrivals from Mauritania, from Senegal. Mauritania, we were shocked. We were like, oh my goodness, how did you get here from East Africa, West Africa, you know, through the southern border. Like you went through such a journey to get here. And at first we heard, you know, just a couple dozen, and then pretty soon it was a couple hundred, over 200 in Aurora, which is a city that borders Denver, still part of the urban corridor. And it was really hard because we didn't have those funds. And like I said, we have a dearth of immigration legal attorneys, and they didn't really have humanitarian parole. They weren't given, they didn't come through the CBP1 app. They weren't granted humanitarian parole. They weren't eligible for TPS. So it's like their only recourse is to ask for asylum. But who's going to fill their asylum applications out? We know through stats and reports and studies that unless you have representation, it's very unlikely that you're going to win your asylum case. Some folks have been able to find attorneys to put in their asylum applications, but many unfortunately have not. And it's heartbreaking because, you know, they only have 1 year to do it. And are they able to make enough money in order to be able to hire an attorney in time to file that asylum application? There are some efforts with the city of Denver. And these Mauritanian folks who I'm talking about, they're mainly in Aurora. The city of Denver, with folks who were in their shelter through April 10th, the city of Denver has started a new program called the Denver Asylum Seekers Project. And for people who were in shelter as of April 10th, they have the opportunity to opt in to the DASP program, they call it. And with that DASP program, they will be provided with legal assistance to help them apply for asylum. And as you all may know, once you apply for asylum, 150 days after the receipt of that application, you can apply for your employment authorization document. And that is the hope that even if it takes a little bit longer, they will be able to apply for that EAD while they're awaiting their asylum application. Thanks.
Thanks, Dee. And Christina, given that you work with a large number of members who are asylum seekers, can you talk also a little bit about the challenges that you've seen? I'm sure, or just provide, what's your perspective, I guess, on some of those challenges that asylum seekers are experiencing in that process? I think you touched a little bit about it at the beginning, but I don't know if you have any stories or ideas of clients that you might have had in the past.
Thanks, Adriel. Yeah, and I'll say that we frequently hear from ASAP members in a number of ways, but specifically, one way I can share is that when someone applies to become an ASAP member, they fill out a form online, and as part of that form, there's an optional free form question which asks, what is one thing you would change about the asylum process? And we've heard from over 80,000 asylum seekers and ASAP members about what they would change about the asylum process. And what we've seen is that ASAP members' top 2 priorities are to address backlogs with work permits and with asylum interviews. And for work permits, ASAP members have identified sort of quicker and easier access to work authorization as one of their top priorities. So that means addressing those waiting periods we're talking about at the beginning, which prevent someone from quickly obtaining a work permit. As Dee mentioned, you have to wait 150 days after you apply for asylum before you can apply for your work permit. And then USCIS by regulation must process that work permit application within 30 days to get to that congressionally mandated 180-day waiting period, or about 6 months until someone can obtain an initial work permit. So ASAP members have proposed, shortening that wait period so that they can more quickly obtain that first work permit. I'll also mention that most ASAP members do not have an attorney. And so ASAP provides a number of resources, such as a virtual legal help desk, and a number of other resources, such as video guides, answers to frequently asked questions, to help ASAP members who are navigating the asylum process on their own. And what ASAP members have said is that they want this process to be more accessible and more transparent so they can do it on their own without having to go through an attorney. So that means shorter and clearer forms, more information in more languages, just an easier and more accessible process so they can apply for asylum and apply for work authorization more easily.
Thanks, Christina. And I just see a question come in about something you just touched on, the difference between the 150 days and the 180 days, and just highlighting that this is part of the complexity that exists, that folks who have no idea about our country's laws or systems have to face when they're coming in to understand when they can actually get to work when they apply for asylum. So can you just touch on that again? Why are there two deadlines, and how do they apply to somebody who's applied for asylum?
Of course, no, it is very confusing. So the 180-day deadline is statutory, which means it's a law that was passed by Congress. And so what that means is that after someone applies for asylum, they have to wait 180 days before they can physically obtain the work permit. Then through regulation, how this process works in practice is that after someone applies for asylum, they have to wait 150 days. And at the 150-day point, they can then apply for a work permit. But after they apply, there's still a processing period. So USCIS has 30 days to process that application. And once that application has been processed, the person then receives the physical work permit card after having waited about 6 months.
Thank you. All right, and so I just wanted to ask you both a general, a bigger question about what have you seen has been the impact of somebody actually being able to obtain a work permit in the United States after they're here, after maybe you've seen them before they got their work permit, and then now they're able to obtain it. Can you tell us a story from what you've seen?
I'll hop in. Thanks, Adriel. So yeah, I was on a panel maybe a month or so ago, and on the panel was a woman, I believe her name was Lisette, from Colombia, and she had arrived, I believe in November or December of 2023. She was actually able to secure a CBP-1 appointment. Her and her husband and her kids were all able to come through on that CBP-1 appointment. She was granted humanitarian parole, and she applied for employment authorization, and she was able to get that pretty quickly. And in Colombia, she was a business owner. She worked her butt off. Sorry, I'm just used to chatting with friends. So she worked really hard, and it didn't matter how much she worked. She just felt like the regulations and the taxes and the inflation, no matter how hard she worked, she could not make her business profitable. And she tried and she tried and she just couldn't do it. And so she said it was a really hard decision, but finally her husband and her decided to migrate to the United States. And once she got the employment authorization, she's an industrial seamstress. There was a company in Colorado who had won a federal contract to provide uniforms for airports all across the country. And for a month, they were trying to figure out how to make these uniforms in the right way according to the specs that they were given in the contract. And everybody was stressing out about it, trying to figure out how they were going to do it. And then once they had a prototype, they needed to mass produce and in order to fulfill this contract. So for a month, they had been trying to figure out this problem. And in walks Lisette. And she's like, oh, what do you need? Okay. And she doesn't speak English fluently yet, but I think there was probably somebody who spoke Spanish at work. She was able to communicate somehow. And she's like, what do you need? Is that what you need? Okay. Her first go, she got the uniform right. So in the first day after this company had tried to solve the problem for a month, she had the prototype. They were like, are you kidding? This is amazing. And then within 1 month, and she was very humble. And so later on, I was talking to her and another nonprofit partner, and the nonprofit partner filled me in on more of the story and bragged on her a little bit because she was super humble. But basically after a month, she had proven herself with her hard work, with her loyalty, with her dedication, that the manager over that position and over this project, they basically did a reorg in the company and moved him to a different location and made her the supervisor, the boss of this unit. And now she has the ability to hire 12 or 13 other employees to fulfill the contract. And that's what I'm talking about. That is exciting. That is a win-win, not only for Colorado, that's a win-win for our country. That's a federal contract that needs to be fulfilled. And I think that's what we need to get back to. Like, I think our current day, our current age, there's this narrative of immigrants being a problem, immigrants, you know, causing problems, but that's not the case. That's not the history of our country. That's not our heritage. We have been a country founded on immigrants. Immigrants work hard. They do a great job. They want to provide for themselves and their families. And that's one story I wanted to share with you.
Thank you. Christina, did you want to share a story as well?
Sure, I can share some of what we've heard from ASAP members. So, as I mentioned, this is one of their top priorities, and we frequently hear from them about how important it is for them to be able to quickly obtain a work permit and then maintain continuous access to work authorization, while they're navigating the asylum process. So, as Dee mentioned, ASAP members, just to elaborate a little bit more, have said that, access to a work permit enables them to provide for themselves and their families, improves their quality of life, opens up access to many other services. ASAP members work in a variety of industries, including medicine, truck driving, ride sharing. And so a work permit allows them to obtain a driver's license and a professional license. And being able to obtain those licenses is also critical to members.
Yeah, I will say, I live in North Carolina, and in order for somebody to be able to get a driver's license, they need a work permit for some proof that they have some type of authorization in the United States. And I think, it's difficult for people who need to get to work, especially in places where, in some of the urban centers, it's more costly to live. So they have to live outside. And so then they have to travel longer distances to work. So it gets very complicated when you have all these systems that are sort of interrelated. And then there's just one piece of that system that's just not falling in line for a person. And then it just makes everything a lot more complicated. So yeah, like you were saying, around professional licenses, people to actually be able to, have a reason to go to college. And, in our state, we're also in need of more workers. I think the state did a study that by 2030, we needed 2 million more workers with at least a bachelor's degree to meet the need. And so there is a huge need, I think, economically here. But, we're still seeing a lot of these barriers. And so I just wanted to put it out to you all. What are you hearing or seeing from the business community? I know that you touched on that there's a labor shortage in Colorado. There's labor shortages, honestly, at the national level, right? When we're thinking about millions of jobs that can't be filled, even if all the folks who are unemployed were able to take a job. And so, yeah, it'd be great to hear what you've heard from business leaders.
Yeah, thanks, Adriel. So the Colorado Business Roundtable is great. They're a partner of ours, and they represent a lot of businesses in Colorado, and they are looking at immigration as one of the solutions to their workforce needs. And we've had great conversations. They are just a great partner. And so I think that in Colorado, businesses are looking for immigration as a solution to their workforce needs. The same with the Colorado Business, I always get their acronym incorrect, but we also partner, I'm gonna just look to see if I can, the Colorado Business Coalition for Immigration Solutions, they're also a great partner and have businesses across the state in every industry as well. And they also, I believe, are looking towards immigrants and for immigration as a workforce solution. I wanted to share a story. If I could back up and share another story, I would love to share another story of a man that I met maybe a couple months ago now. He was a welder in his home country, and he did not have employment authorization for a while, but then he was able to gain employment authorization. And because he is, not innovated, he just has his own initiative and his own desires. He wanted to make it work. He has two beautiful little girls. He was like, you know what, I'm just going to Google welding companies. So he Googled welding companies, and he showed up to a welding company, which was maybe a mile or so away from where he was staying. And the owner of the welding company was like, hi. And he's like, hi there, I'm wondering if you have any work. And he's like, No, I don't, but I'm going to lunch right now. If you want to come back at 2 o'clock, I'll see what your welding skills are like. Um, and so the new arrival, the new Coloradan was like, you know what, I'll just take a seat here. I'll just wait. And so the business owner went out, grabbed lunch, ate lunch, and the gentleman sat there the whole time. And then afterwards, he's like, okay, let's see what you got. And so he tested our new Coloradan on his welding skills, and he passed beautifully. And so the owner offered him a position on the spot because he saw he was a great welder. And even though he didn't need to hire somebody, he decided to hire somebody because of his skills. And this gentleman received employment authorization, was able to work for this welder, and is already starting to think about starting his own business, because knowing that welding is something that you could make a lot of money, it's lucrative, you could provide for yourself and your family. At that same time, at that same panel and meeting, I met another family who actually was not eligible for TPS and didn't gain employment authorization. And it was really heartbreaking because they are still trying to make it work. You can tell that there is desperation in their faces, and they are, making arepas, at the place that they're staying, trying to sell them on the street, making candy, trying to sell that on the street. And that is just so challenging compared to if everybody was able to get employment authorization and go to work.
Thank you. Yeah, it just goes to the idea that people will make it work as best they can, right? And because we all have to work to sustain ourselves, to pay for food, for our housing. And so thank you for those stories. I think that they're super powerful just to hear, what people are going through, and then how they're able to just get out of those circumstances. But also it just, I think, paints a picture of just people, right? People who just happen to have come to the United States because of dire circumstances in their home countries, and they just want to get to work. And, I've actually spoken to folks who maybe are more conservative leaning, but they have known people who are immigrants in North Carolina for all their lives. And, they're like, this is a great person. Like just being able to hear stories and know people, I think it's really important to really break down some of those barriers. And so I'll go into our last question for you all, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So just thinking about, what I heard from UD was that, civil society and local governments have really had to step up in a really big way. And in some ways, the Biden administration, through some of these clinics and coordination with you all, have been able also to work on some of these issues. But one call to action that we heard from Christina was, there is a bill that's able to remove some barriers for asylum applicants, but we don't really hear a lot about what Congress is doing. So there's a lot of gridlock in Congress, and so how can and somebody else asked this question, like, how can they get involved in advocacy? Like, how can constituents, business owners get involved in this conversation, given that there is gridlock in Congress?
Sorry, I lost my cursor for a second. It's a great question. We honestly need a huge wave of change in terms of the narrative. We need Congress to know from all of their constituents that the current narrative and the current do nothing state of being is not acceptable. We need to come together and say, no, immigrants make America work. They have for decades. This is what has made our country great, along with our African-American brothers and sisters who were slaves in this country and built this country up, and our Native American brothers and sisters. Next come immigrants. We have made this country great as well. And so I think a recognition of that, and a do not turn your back on immigrants now, especially when this country actually, there's, I have so many thoughts going through my head, because you have the humanitarian argument, but you also have the economic argument. You also have the national security argument. You have so many arguments. Pick a sector and I can give you an argument. So like for our economy, we're not able to meet our workforce needs. We're not able to grow our economy. A lot of our innovation comes from immigrants. Canada, about, I think it was just a year ago, they stole, that's such a harsh word, but they enticed all of our, I believe it was H-1B, or maybe I have it wrong, visa workers. They said, you know what? The US gives H-1B visa workers a visa to work, but they don't put them on a path to citizenship. They don't put them on a path to permanent residence. They don't give their spouses any benefits. Here in Canada, we will give you all of that. We will give you a path to permanent residence, a path to citizenship. We'll let your spouse work, and I think in less than a week, they fulfilled their quota of, I believe it was 10,000 H-1B visa workers that they basically enticed to Canada. So we are not able to compete as a country in a global economy if we don't make changes. The same with our national security. We have not been able to meet our recruitment numbers. And back in the day, before or during the world wars, we would have refugees come. We would turn around and say, you know what, we'll give you a green card, we'll give you citizenship if you go back and fight our wars. That was US military policy. And there are so many sectors of our country that depend on immigrants, that depend on immigration, even if you don't believe in the humanitarian cause of immigration, which obviously I do, but maybe some other people don't. And so I just think that as a country, whether you have conservative representatives or more liberal representatives, you can pick any sector and make this argument to your representatives, to your congressmen, to your senators, and say, hey, enough is enough. Enough of this political divisiveness. Immigration has not always been a politically divisive issue. It just has been a fact. It's been the way America runs. And now it's become partisan for whatever reason. And so let's stop that and let's get back to the business of doing what's right for our country. And let's pass comprehensive immigration reform that's commonsensical to everybody.
I can jump in here too and add a little bit more to what Dee is saying. So I mentioned earlier, ASAP members have shared their concerns with us, but they also have shared a number of recommendations for how to improve this process. And as Dee mentioned, these solutions to these challenges not only benefit, applicants and their families and communities, but also employers who are looking to address labor shortages and so many stakeholders in this process. So we talked a little bit about actions the administration can take to make this process easier. And just to jump back to that, we talked a lot about processing delays, and there are things the administration can do to fix these delays, which ASAP members have identified. So it looks like hiring more staff, authorizing more overtime, dedicating more personnel to processing work permit applications. And it's worth mentioning, applicants who are applying for work authorization are also in other backlogs at USCIS. They might be in the asylum backlog or even a green card backlog. And so, access to work authorization is critical while people are navigating these different processes. And then even more so, ASAP members have also recommended shortening the work permit application, which would save USCIS time and make this process easier for applicants themselves. So those are some actions on the administrative side. We touched a little bit about Congress. There is gridlock, but as Dee is saying, we are seeing that quicker access to work authorization for people seeking asylum is a bipartisan issue. So for those who are interested, there is a bill. It's HR 1325, the Asylum Seeker Work Authorization Act. It was introduced by Representative Pingree from Maine. Representative Salazar, who's a Republican from Florida, also co-sponsored this bill. And it would shorten that mandatory 180-day waiting period that we talked about earlier. So if this bill became law, asylum seekers who applied for initial work permit would only have to wait 30 days after they applied for asylum in order to be able to obtain that initial work permit. So it would shorten the 180-day waiting period to just 30. Then ASAP members are very involved with this bill and writing this bill and with this solution. The one other thing the bill does is that it eliminates the need to renew a work permit, which also frees up time at USCIS. That's less applications that they have to process. And so that's another kind of critical benefit of this bill. So there's so many ways for constituents, business owners, and others to get involved and build support. And one other way I'll just highlight is that there is a campaign called the Let Asylum Seekers Work campaign, where people can get involved, reach out to their member of Congress, and ask them to support this bill. And I believe there's an opportunity to share follow-up material, so we'd be more than happy to share that campaign page, that Take Action page, so people can share that and get involved.
Thanks, Christina. And yes, we will be sharing this recording as well as some materials with everyone afterward. And so now we're going to shift over to answer some questions from the audience. As a reminder, you can enter your questions in the Q&A box on your screen, not the chat box. That is disabled. So we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And so, you know, just because you talked about HR 1325, Christina, we're going to start with you. This particular audience member wants to know, what's the possibility of HR 1325 moving in this Congress?
It's a great question. It's a tough question. I mean, we are in an election year. There is bipartisan support, so it's hard to say whether this bill will move this year. It's possible that pieces of it, so for example, that 30-day piece could maybe move more quickly than other pieces. But I think right now, the goal is to really build more public awareness and support for this legislation, so it can be in a position to pass quickly.
Thanks, Christina. And could you just also mention the campaign? Somebody also just put in interest in wanting to get groups together to advocate for this bipartisan bill.
Yes, no, happy to share more about the campaign page. You know, it's designed for multiple stakeholders, you know, business leaders, constituents. So wherever you might fall in that category, welcome you to take action. You know, tell members of Congress why this legislation is important, why access to work authorization is important for people who are seeking asylum or who have just recently arrived in the United States. So we welcome people's participation in that campaign.
Thanks, Christina. And just again, it's the Let Asylum Seekers Work. You can Google it or wait for that link afterward as well. And so we have an audience member that asked if there's an Office of New Americans in all major cities. We wish, but I wonder if Dee, you wanted to talk about the ONA network just a little bit?
Thanks, Adriel. That would be great if there was an ONA in every state across the country. I believe now we have 21 states who are in the Office of New Americans National Network. If your state is interested in joining the ONA network or in starting an Office of New Americans, those 21 offices are in all stages. So some states have just one fellow or one policy person in their governor's office. And then some have a full-blown office that was established by state law. The way Colorado got involved was under Governor Polis and my boss, Secretary Joe Barella of the Department of Labor and Employment. They were interested in doing more in the immigration space and with new Americans. And so I don't know if they contacted the Emerson Collective or vice versa, but the Emerson Collective provided funding, seed funding for a fellowship that started in the governor's office. And that was my predecessor, Kit Tainter. And she was a fellow for a couple of years, and she was running a New American initiative out of Governor Polis's office. And through that work, they decided to pass a bill that established the Colorado Office of New Americans. But that would be your first step, is reaching out to the Emerson Collective. And then the folks that run the network are the American Immigration Council, along with the WES, which World Education Service, I think I got that acronym right, and the Emerson Collective all run the ONA National Network. So we convene every month, we talk about things, we meet with the White House, we meet with the federal government, and it's a good supportive community. And from red states and blue states and purple states, because as I was saying before, everybody realizes that they want immigration, they need immigrants. The more conservative states are needing them for workforce and talent. The more blue states are like, yes, we want workforce, but we also need family reunification. We also, there are other issues that we're concerned about and worried about. But we're a network, and I hope you can join.
Great, thank you so much, Dee. And so a lot of folks are actually bringing in questions about just general barriers people are experiencing. And so one of them is actually kind of what you touched on a little bit, Dee, is that, a lot of focus is on new arrivals, but, unfortunately with, Congress not having enacted comprehensive immigration reform for more than 30 years, there's a large population of folks who just don't have status. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in Colorado and in your work at Colorado's ONA with folks who may not necessarily have an option because Congress hasn't created an option for them?
Yeah, honestly, it's heartbreaking. I was at this same presentation where I met Lisette. After the presentation, I had a teenager come up to me and she just started bawling. She's like, I didn't do anything wrong. I came when I was a baby. I don't have status. I don't know what I can do in my life. Like, what can I do? I can go to school and then who's going to hire me? Like, what is my job? And her younger sister was born here. And so in the same family, like one of the children get to fulfill all of their dreams and expectations. And this teenager in front of me is heartbroken and bawling. It's making me want to cry still. And so we are worried at ONA about our undocumented Coloradans. We want, our vision and our mission of our office is that all new Americans can thrive. They can be in our economic, social, and cultural community and thrive, give to it and take from it and make Colorado a more beautiful place. There's one program I'd like to just mention that we have for our undocumented Coloradans. It's a novel program. Sorry about that, my phone started ringing. It's a novel program nationwide. It's called the Benefit Recovery Fund. It is an unemployment program for eligible undocumented workers. It is, I think, like I said, I think it's first of its kind in the country. It was passed by Senate Bill 22234. And I think it was passed because during COVID, during the pandemic, everybody who had employment authorization was able to rely on unemployment insurance. They were able to rely on pandemic unemployment insurance when they got laid off, when all the restaurants shut down, when nobody did any more travel. A lot of our big a lot of our big economic sectors in Colorado are hospitality, tourism. So we had a lot of folks being laid off, and a lot of our undocumented workers had nowhere to turn for assistance. They didn't have any of the federal benefit programs. They had very limited state benefit programs, and they didn't have any of the emergency assistance. And so our state legislature passed the Benefit Recovery Fund, Senate Bill 22234. Governor Polis signed it, and we were just able to launch it in April of 2024. So we've only been operational for 2 months now, and we took time to ensure a couple of things. A third-party administrator administrates it because of data privacy concerns. We want to ensure that community members know that the state government isn't keeping all of this data, that their information is secure. And we also wanted to make sure that we were preventing against fraud, because ideally this program, it lasts for forever and we prevent as much fraud as possible so that the money is actually going to the Coloradans who need it. So that's just one program that we have. We don't have we don't have a big budget, and we don't have a lot of discretionary funds. So I would love, if and when we get there, I would love to develop more programs for all of our Coloradans, all of our new Americans, but that's just one that I can highlight at this point.
Thanks, Dee. And just broadly speaking, we're getting a lot of questions about parole, who qualifies for parole. And I just wanted to bring up, the Biden administration has created several parole programs to be able to, create an orderly pathway for people to enter the United States, representing themselves at the border through CBP-1, but also to dissuade people from coming to the border by other programs like the Family Reunification Program and country-specific programs. And so, there is a movement now, and led by the American Business Immigration Coalition and other groups, to try to see if parole can be used as a way to provide work authorization for people in the United States. And so I know that there's a lot of questions about what can be done for folks who are here in the United States, who have been here for years, and that is a campaign that folks are trying to see if they can get some movement on. So I just wanted to make sure folks knew that as well, that that's something that's going on. It's not, everything takes effort, and then we have to wait and see if, if it actually will come to fruition. But I wanted to, turn back to you, Christina. And, there are a few questions here about like asylum work permit processing, but then there's also a shout out to ASAP, because there was litigation that actually forced USCIS to process asylum based work permits faster. So could you just talk a little bit about that litigation, why it was needed, and what you're seeing around processing times for asylum-based work permits?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I should say there's a number of lawsuits related to work authorization for asylum seekers, including one from the American Immigration Council. But to talk a little bit more about ASAP's lawsuit, this was back during the last administration, under the Trump administration. There was an effort in that administration to actually make the waiting period for an initial work permit for someone seeking asylum even longer. So it would have required someone to wait a year before they could have access to a work permit. And at the time, ASAP was much smaller and only about 5,000 members. And ASAP asked ASAP members, there were so many regulations happening at the time related to immigration to asylum, which regulations were members most concerned about? And what ASAP members responded is that this regulation related to work authorization was of prime importance to them. And so ASAP laid out kind of a number of different ways that people could proceed. And ASAP members said that they did want to bring a lawsuit. And there were different levels at which ASAP members could bring this lawsuit. It could be as ASAP the organization, or a more kind of collective model. And ASAP polled members, and members responded that they kind of wanted a medium level of association. And thanks to that decision, sort of due to the complicated nature of the lawsuit, that regulation was enjoined, but only for people who were members of two organizations, ASAP and Casa de Maryland. ASAP is a remote organization, and so people can apply to become an ASAP member online. And so as a result of that decision, the old rules, so the 180-day period, applied instead of the year-long waiting period. And so what we saw was a dramatic increase in ASAP membership. And thanks to ASAP members' decisions, that opened up quicker access to work authorization for so many more asylum seekers. And now we're up to over 600,000 members as a result of that lawsuit. And so many other lawsuits that have kind of challenged regulations to improve processing times and to make sure that USCIS is complying with that 30-day processing period. So we had seen, maybe a year or two ago, that there were very long delays in processing the initial work permit application, thanks to ASAP members' advocacy and this, so many other lawsuits, including one from the American Immigration Council. That processing time has improved. And now we're seeing that USCIS is close to processing about 90% of initial work permit applications for asylum seekers within 30 days. But of course, that's after someone has already waited, 150 days to apply, and they have to wait 6 months before they can get the initial work permit. So those processing times have improved. We are seeing some quicker turnaround times for work permits based on parole, but there's still very long delays for work permits based on temporary protected status and for work permit renewal applications for people seeking asylum.
Thanks, Christina. And so just quickly, I also wanted to mention, Dee brought this up, and also somebody from the submitted a comment that there is also a bill that's pending in Congress as well. It's the registry. It would update the registry. And so, The registry is something that started in the 1920s. It had been updated like 3 times, where if people had been living in the United States for a certain number of years, or before like a certain date, then they would automatically become eligible to apply for residency. If they met the requirements, they then have certain particular criminal backgrounds. And so there's a bill that actually aims to update the registry in a way where it would actually also be rolling. And so then people wouldn't have to necessarily wait for Congress to act. It would just, the premise would be, you know, folks have been here for a certain period of time. And so as time progresses, it's in the interest of our country to be able to integrate folks into our economy, into our educational systems, into just all our systems, right? And so they're HR 1511 and SB 2606 if you're interested. And so we're at time. And so thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. We hope that you found the presentation informative and engaging. As a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be emailed to all registrants very soon with some links. And we have other webinars planned soon, so please watch out for those invitations. The Council relies on contributions from people like you to continue our work. We hope you will continue to support the Council and invite you to visit our website at americanimmigrationcouncil.org to subscribe for updates, check our extensive resources, and make a donation. Thanks again for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you. Thanks, Dee. Thanks, Christina. Have a good day, everyone.